Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past couple of weeks of reading. I just came back from a week out of town visiting family. Before I left, I had been reading Why We Read What We Read, the subheading of which is A Delightfully Opinionated Journey Through Contemporary Bestsellers. This is written by Lisa Adams and John Heath, and takes a look at bestsellers other than standard curriculum-related bestsellers. At the beginning I was very amused with this because it opens with a description of a book that could be basically any of Dan Brown's popular books and points out that they're all basically the same. And that was funny to start with, but as it goes on, the authors just basically mock a lot of genres and a lot of styles of writing that are probably mock-worthy, but put together in a book like this, it actually started turning me off, and I got about 3/4 of the way through and thought, I need to put this aside, because it started to feel like they were punching down. It's not challenging to make fun of a certain flavor of thriller and a certain flavor of mystery, and then a certain flavor of self-help, and a certain flavor of what I think you would call not very challenging religious or spiritual writing. It just made me think, these people are enormous snobs. On their own, most of these things would be things that I would agree with. I do think that most of the sort of pop psychology and pop religion and pop new age and a lot of those top 10 thrillers that are basically interchangeable are not the best writing. But having this book together mocking all of that and basically mocking people for enjoying it started to turn me off, even though really in general I don't disagree with any of the points that they're making. I do think it's poorly done. I do think people could engage with higher levels and more interesting plots or more interesting spiritual or psychological ideas. But altogether, it really started to feel unpleasant. So I do think I'll go back to that because on its own I did find each of the chapters to be pretty entertaining, but just altogether it started to feel like a lot of snobbery. The next few things that I read were all basically sports related. So the first of those sporting related books that I read was The Games, A Global History of the Olympics by David Goldblatt. Goldblatt goes through the history of the modern games from Pierre de Coubertin's ideas in the late 1800s through to just before the Rio Games started. Overall, it's an interesting look at the politics and the socio-cultural changes that were driving both the Olympic movement in the early days and the growth of it into the big international festival that it is today. And all of that was quite interesting. He goes a lot into the almost fetishization that those turn-of-the-century Europeans had of ancient Greece, and how not all of the ideas of the ancient Olympics were actually correct. For example, the athletes in the ancient games weren't actually amateurs, so that strong push towards amateurism actually had more to do with kind of Victorian Edwardian class issue towards what one should be doing in one's leisure time, which is an interesting take on that. It doesn't look particularly at sport, except to mention, for example, it will talk about the number of European and European descended athletes in the early games, and I think in some of them that he will point out when the only non-European descended people were, for example, a single Aboriginal Canadian and 2 Black Americans in one game. He talks a little bit about one-offs of, before the Paralympics existed, of disabled athletes who showed up 1 or 2 in the early games, which then gets ignored basically until London. So there was a bit of a gap in that I think could have been filled in more, but that's maybe more about my interests than it is about what the author was aiming for. The book is laid out chronologically in sets of basically 2 to 4 games, and as the winter games get added in, there are a few too many years into each chapter as it goes along. So, for example, I think there were only about 2 sentences about the Calgary Games, which, again, because of my own interests, I would have liked to have heard more about that and less about some of the others. But again, I think in being such a long-ranging focus, it cut back on his ability to really dig down into a lot of things. So while I thought the early bits were very interesting, in part because there were no winter games in those days and it was such a smaller competition, so he has more ability to talk about that, and as it goes on, there's just too much information, so much more has to be left out. I mean, in a lot of ways, I would have almost liked to have read a book of similar length just about, say, the first 40 years of the Olympics, and then maybe a look at some of the later controversies, because he gets into the issues of bribes being paid by cities to obtain the games, and other political issues. The displacement, for example, of city poor or homeless communities that get pushed out when the games are being developed. So there are a lot of those elements that, again, I think a separate book would have been interesting. A lot of that does seem to be very well researched, but the issue that I had was that the sporting, although this has a focus on the culture and the politics rather than the sport, a lot of the sporting information that is in there is not nearly as well researched, so a lot of it is very either superficial or some of it is wrong. At one point he refers to an American figure skater who was basically a top 10 skater, but never really top of the podium, and he refers to him as a Canadian world champion. So that's wrong on 2 points, both the nationality and the rank. So because I noticed that, and that those aren't the researched parts that are then noted in the references, I didn't trust a lot of the non-political information that was in the book. So while this was very interesting, I couldn't give it full points because as that implies, I didn't really trust the level of research when it came to sport. And because this mixes those three things, politics and culture and sport, if 1/3 of that is suspect, it just isn't that strong of a read, unfortunately. But I did think the politics were interesting. And if it had just been a book about those first 40 years in the politics, I think that would have been fascinating. After that, I read Ken Dryden's The Game. This was originally published in 1983, and this was the 20th anniversary edition, which came out in 2003. Ken Dryden is a politician and a lawyer and a former goalie for the Montreal Canadiens. And this book is a look at, in theory, a day-by-day breakdown of a week in his final year of playing in the late 70s. But really what it digs down into is kind of the culture of hockey in Canada, how the culture of hockey changed as it was expanding with more American teams and teams further away from the border. And he looks a little bit forward into how more and more European players were coming over to play in North America. He looks a bit at the culture of the Francophone-Anglophone divide in 1970s Montreal, which given 70s Quebec politics is really fascinating, and that was really interesting stuff. He looks at the change in the professionalization of hockey at younger and younger levels, which I thought was really interesting to think about how that looked in the early 80s compared to how it looked now. I don't necessarily agree with some of the things that he says. I think one of the points that he makes is that kids who are playing professional style or formal games more and more at younger ages aren't having the same creative time. And I don't think those things are necessarily at odds with each other. I know I have a 10-year-old nephew who is on several teams, a travel team and the local team, and is very seriously into that, but still plays a lot of street hockey. So I don't know that those are necessarily at odds with each other, but it was definitely interesting to read about that. It's a very interesting perspective because virtually everyone else that he was playing with had finished their formal education at either 16 or 18. And he was a guy who had been to university and had a legal degree and had articled and everything. So he's able to write about it in a way that I think you don't see in a lot of sports memoirs, because he wrote this himself. This wasn't done alongside a journalist or by a ghostwriter. So it was definitely really interesting. I was surprised. I think it's very interesting even if you are not particularly a hockey fan, or even if you're a hockey fan and you don't like the Habs. I think you could still read that and find a lot of interest in it, because while it is about the sport and it is about that moment in that particular team at that particular time with this particular set of players, it's really about a lot of other things and about the culture and the politics and the balance and language. And yeah, it was just brilliant. I think that was probably one of the most interesting things I have read so far this year. After that, I read another memoir of professional sport, but from the other side, from the consumer side rather than the athlete side, and that is Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch. And it's basically a memoir of his evolution as a fan of Arsenal from the age of 11 to the age of his mid-30s. This was written in the early 90s and is a really interesting look at how football fandom changes and how the evolution of attitudes towards, for example, hooliganism, the change of being able to watch matches on TV versus of having to either be there or listen to them on the radio. Kind of the culture around first division versus second versus, for example, fourth, and are the fans crazier if you're following a fourth division team? So I thought that was really interesting. And similarly with the game, this book is looking at not just sport, but the way sport mirrors changes in culture that are happening and changes in politics, and how all professional sport holds a mirror up to that. So I really liked that I read those two books back to back, because they really are similar looks at a similar period in time. And obviously these are two different sports in two different countries, but you do feel a very similar kind of cultural drive behind them. Really fascinating stuff. So I really enjoyed reading that one as well. Now maybe you don't like soccer, maybe you're one of those people who are like, eh, don't like football, meh. But I think there's a lot to enjoy in there. I think it's fascinating because this isn't really, it's not a narrative-driven story, so it's funny to me that they've made two films out of this. One which I think is a more literal translation, if you will, with Colin Firth, and one is an American remake with, I think, John Cusack, but it's about baseball rather than football. So that's kind of fascinating, even though clearly I'm not an Arsenal supporter. And finally, one book that I have not quite finished is Home and Away, Writing the Beautiful Game. Karl Knausgård and Fredrik Ekelund, who were writing to each other during the 2014 World Cup and talk about writing and life and what's new with the family and about football. It is not necessarily a soccer-driven story, but the matches as they're happening are sort of the background that these letters have in common with each other. So I've been enjoying it because a lot of the letters, quite honestly, feel a little pretentious to me, so I'm not a huge fan of that. But at the same time, during the 2014 World Cup, I was on a road trip across the eastern United States. We were driving from Miami to DC with a couple of my husband's cousins were over from London. And I mean, we would stop to watch matches in the middle of nowhere because we needed to, follow things and see what was happening. So they'll talk about in a particular match, and I will think, well, that's when we were in Charleston, and that's when we were in Chapel Hill. So I'm enjoying it that way, but again, that has more to do with the way I'm making the connection between a particular sporting event and them making this other connection that they're discussing. Which, quite honestly, I think is what sport does what kind of international competitions like that or the big professional sporting events are kind of about. It's about creating this kind of artificial commonality that you don't really have, but there's this external thing that you can focus on, and I kind of love that about sport. And I think, although on the flip side, I think that's what some people hate about sport. So I'm not particularly loving the writing in that one, but I do enjoy the experience of reading it just because it reminds me of other things. But I did think that both The Game and Fever Pitch were brilliant and really interesting looks at sport and culture and the relationship in between, which I think a lot of sports memoirs are not necessarily able to do. So both of those really blew me away. So even if you don't care about the Habs and you don't care about Arsenal, I still think those are both worth reading. Anyway, that's been my reading for the week. I'd love to know, what are your favorite sports-related books? Whether it's fiction, nonfiction, memoirs, histories, I'd love to know. And what do you like or not like about them? I'd be curious to hear about that, because I feel like I don't see that many videos of people talking about sports-related writing. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.